So if we want to understand what a conventional account of language is, the first thing we got to do is understand, well, what is a convention? And Lewis is going to give an account of what conventions are. One of the things in particular he's trying to do is to give an understanding of a convention where it could make sense for a convention to arise naturally or non-linguistically. That is, it could happen that we start acting according to a convention, that a convention arises, but it's not like we all sort of sat down and made the decision to make something a convention. It just sort of arose spontaneously out of the way that we're acting. As we said, that's going to be really important for language use, because it would be a serious problem if, in order to have a convention, you had to sort of have a conversation where you decided to have a convention. If that's what a convention was, well then there would just be no hope of giving a conventional analysis of meaning, because basically you would have to already know a language before you know any language, and so the analysis wouldn't get off the ground. So let's start off by just thinking about some examples of convention. And we're going to go by the examples that Lewis gave in the little bit of the book that I asked you to read. So here are a handful. So one convention is that in the US, and in fact in most of the world, people drive on the right-hand side of the road. That's a simple example of a convention. Languages, arguably, are examples of convention. It's a convention that English is spoken in the US. It's a convention that French is spoken in France. But we can have sort of conventions amongst smaller groups of people. You can imagine a group of friends who have a convention that when they go to the movie theater, they always meet at the subway stop. They have a convention of meeting there before they go to the movies. Another example Lewis gives is the firewood example. Imagine a bunch of people are camping together, they need to gather some firewood. It could be a convention amongst them that anytime they go camping, one particular person goes north, another particular person goes south, another person goes east, another person goes west, with all of them going in different directions so that they don't sort of with all of them going in different directions so that they're not covering the same ground repeatedly. One last interesting example Lewis gives is, imagine people are rowing. Now, to row effectively, you have to row in a certain kind of rhythm. You can't be sort of rowing arbitrarily and not caring about what your rowing partner is doing. So you'll sort of settle into a certain kind of rhythm. And Lewis says, well, we can kind of think about that as a certain kind of convention. Because, well, there's a bunch of different ways you could row, maybe a bunch of different rhythms that would do the job, but you do happen to settle into one or other of them when you go rowing. So those are a bunch of different examples of convention. Now, if we want to give an analysis of convention, if we want to say what it is that makes them conventions, it's worth thinking about each of them and asking, well, what are the central features? Like, why do they all belong on this list of conventions, whereas other things clearly don't? Well, let's start off with a very obvious one. When something is a convention amongst a bunch of people, it seems like they generally do that thing. The reason why it's a convention, or part of the reason why it's a convention that people in the US drive on the right, is because that's what, in fact, everybody does. Most of the time, almost all of the time, people drive on the right. That's why it's a convention, or it's at least part of why it's a convention. Likewise with speaking English. If people weren't speaking English all the time, it presumably wouldn't be a convention. Or with the subway stop, if the friends had decided to meet somewhere else, well then it wouldn't be a convention that they met at the subway stop. So a first really obvious thing is that for something to be a convention amongst a group of people, it has to be that they actually do that thing. But that's not quite enough. There are actually a lot more things that seem to be involved in going into convention. Because think about the driving case. So as a matter of fact, everybody in the US drives on the right. But it's not just that they drive on the right, but they're also aware that everybody else does that, and the fact that everybody else is doing that sort of gives you a reason to do it as well. Because imagine a case where sort of everybody woke up one day and they sort of just randomly decided to drive on the right-hand side of the road. Everybody separately and independently came to that decision. Obviously this is kind of a pretty kind of fanciful thought experiment, but just run with it. So they all just individually decide to drive on the right, and in that case they get very, very lucky because it's good that they all decided to do the same thing. In the case like that, would we describe their driving on the right as a convention? It looks like the answer is no, because what each person decides to do is completely independent of what everybody else is doing. They would have continued to maybe drive on the right even if nobody else had been doing that, or not enough people had been doing that. So in a situation like that, the mere fact that everybody's driving on the right doesn't seem to mean that it's a convention. So it's got to be that there's more to a convention than just everybody's doing it. And it looks like at least two minimum conditions are, well, you have to believe that everybody else is doing it too, more or less. And not only that, but your belief that everybody else is doing it has to sort of be a reason for you to do it as well. So think about the actual case of driving on the road. Why do we decide to drive on the road? Well, basically, the reasoning is, well, we know that that's what everybody else is doing, and it's clear that given everybody else is driving on the road, that's the side I want to be driving on as well. Because if everybody else is driving on the right, but I decide to drive on the left, well, obviously that's clearly a disaster. And that really seems very centrally tied to why this is a convention in the first place, why it is a convention to drive on the right-hand side of the road. It's not just that everybody does it, everybody's aware that that's the done thing. People know that people drive on the right. And the fact that everybody else is doing it is a pretty good reason for me to do it as well. And this goes for all the other cases as well. Like, think about the friends meeting at the subway case. It's not just that they randomly, individually decide to meet there. It's that each of them knows that that is the meeting place, that is the place you go to when you want to meet your friends to go to the movies. And given that you know that everybody else acts in accordance with that, well, if you want to meet your friends, well, that's where you got to go. So it's the fact that you know that this is the meeting place that gives you a reason to act in accordance with the convention as well. In that case, that means it gives you a reason to go to the meeting place. And the same things go for the Firewood case and the rowing case. Knowing that it's the done thing for me to go south looking for firewood, that will give me reason to do it, because I know nobody else is going to do it. Yet another important feature of all of these conventions is that everybody prefers that everybody does their part. It's better for everybody if everybody accords to the convention. So everybody prefers everybody to do their part. So think about the driving on the road case. Obviously, it's clearly better if everybody drives on the right all the time, rather than sometime, randomly picking which side to choose on or something like that. Once we've established that convention, it's in everybody's interest that everybody play their role. That's again really clear in the case with the firewood. Given that there's a convention maybe for me to go south and for you to go north and Alice to go east and Billy to go west, it's in everybody's interest that everybody do their part. If somebody stops doing their part, well then people are in general going to be worse off. The final important property for our purposes is going to be that there is a certain level of arbitrariness in all of these examples, despite what I just said, despite the fact that we all prefer everybody to play their part. There's also a certain level of arbitrariness. This is really easy to see in the movie case. So as a matter of fact, all the friends decide to meet at the subway. But we can imagine in lots of different places, lots of different cities people might be living, well, there's a range of equally good meeting places. The subway might not be the only good place to meet, maybe in front of the movie theatre or near the cafe beside the movie theatre. There are lots of different equally good places. So there's no one way things could have gone. Now, it's still true that everybody prefers that everybody do their part, but it's only that because there's already a convention to go to meet at the subway, everybody prefers to do their part. If, for instance, there had instead been a convention to meet at the cafe, well then that would have been what everybody preferred. So there's a certain level of arbitrariness in that example. There are a number of equally good candidates for a convention. The same thing is obviously true of the driving on the road case. There's nothing intrinsically better about driving on the right than driving on the left. Could have been, if we had all decided to drive on the left instead, that would have been just as good. Now, given that we have decided to drive on the right, we shouldn't drive on the left, but before there was a convention, a convention for driving on the left would have been equally good. The same thing is true in the Firewood case. Different people could have gone different directions. There's nothing intrinsically necessarily better about that. It's kind of arbitrary which one we pick. So we've already now talked about the main conditions of Lewis's account of convention. I will say now what his sort of official definition is. So he defines it in terms of regularities. And a regularity, as he stresses in Languages and Language, it's important that we can think of it as a regularity in action, i.e. a kind of thing that people do regularly. Or we can think of it as a regularity in belief. That means it's a kind of pattern of beliefs that tends to arrive regularly. The reason why he's talking about beliefs is because we're going to have to think in terms of beliefs rather than actions when we get to language. But we'll come back to that later. So Any convention is a sort of regularity, either in action or belief. But what does it take for a regularity in action or belief to be a regularity? Well, Lewis says that there are 6 conditions, and the 5 that we have already talked about are really the important ones. So our kind of regularity is a convention amongst a population, i.e. a group of people, only if the following conditions hold, or they more or less hold. He is thinking that there can be like small number of exceptions. But firstly, it's got to be that everybody conforms to the regularity. Can't be a regularity unless people actually do it regularly. So it's got to be that people conform to it. But as we said, just the mere fact that everybody does it does not necessarily make it a convention. It's got to be that everybody believes that everybody conforms to the regularity. It's got to be that everybody believes, for instance, that people drive on the right. Moreover, believing that everybody else conforms to the regularity must give each individual person in the population a reason for themselves to conform to the regularity. So remember, in the driving case, believing that everybody else drives on the right gives me a very, very good reason to drive on the right myself. Believing that everybody else conforms to the regularity gives me a reason to conform to the regularity as well. He's careful when he talks about this in terms of reasons to say either a practical or an epistemic reason. What is a practical reason? Well, a practical reason is just a reason to act in a certain way. An epistemic reason is just a reason to believe a certain kind of thing. The reason why he wants to say both practical and epistemic is because it's not really obvious that you decide what to believe. Rather, it's kind of you weigh up the evidence and you're almost forced to believe whatever you think that most fits the evidence. Because he recognizes that believing things and deciding to do things are not exactly the same, he phrases it in terms of reasons either for belief or for action. So those are our first 3 conditions. Widespread conformity, everybody believes everybody conforms, everybody has a reason to conform given that everybody else conforms. The 4th condition we talked about was everybody should prefer that in general everybody conform. So everybody prefers general conformity to the regularity to slightly less than general conformity. So in the driving case, we prefer that everybody drive on the right-hand side of the road rather than most people drive on the right but a small number of people drive on the left. That would cause catastrophe. Likewise, when people are meeting up, we prefer that everybody go to the meeting place rather than just most people go to the meeting place and some people don't. That's a recipe for chaos. In the camping case, we prefer that everybody do their assigned part, everybody go in the direction they're supposed to be going, rather than most people do that and some people go in a different direction, because that would be a sort of that would be sort of a waste of time to search an area of the forest that other people had already searched. So we want it to be, so everybody has an interest, everybody has a stake in everybody else playing their part. The last thing we talked about was this arbitrariness. The way that Lewis captures this is by saying, well, the regularity we're interested in, that we're saying is a convention, it's not the only one with all of these properties. There are other ways things could have gone, which would have been equally good from the point of view of being a convention. The final thing Lewis adds that we haven't talked about is he says that all of these conventions have to be common knowledge. Common knowledge is basically this very kind of complicated mental state. For something to be common knowledge, it's not just that everybody believes it, but it has to be that everybody believes that everybody believes it, everybody believes that everybody believes that everybody believes it, and so on. That's there for reasons that are not really important to us. So we're basically, for our purposes, we can just forget about the common knowledge element of convention. We're going to mostly think about the 5 properties. Widespread conformity, there's a belief that there's widespread conformity. Believing that there's widespread conformity gives you reason to conform. You prefer that everybody conform rather than some people, that most but not all people conform. But there's also other possible conventions that would have been equally good. Those are our 5 conditions that we're going to focus on. So that's what a convention is, on Lewis's definition. But now let's come back to this other question of, how might a convention naturally arise? Now, Lewis does think that one way for a convention to arise is genuinely that we have a spoken agreement to act in that way. So, for instance, in the case of the meeting place among friends, one way for that to be a convention is just for them all to verbally agree that that's the place, that is where they'll meet. But that's not the only way it could be a convention. So Lewis does think that a natural way for something to be a convention is for us all to agree for it to be a convention. So take the movie case again. One way for it to be a convention that we meet at the subway is for us all to agree that when we go to the movies, we'll meet at the subway. That's one way for a convention to arise. But there are other non-linguistic ways for a convention to arise as well. And we can see that by thinking of a natural variant on the movie theater case. So imagine there is no standing agreement on where we meet to go to the movie theater. But we all remember that the last time we met up, we met at the subway. And so what we decide to do is like, well, I know that so I remember that that's where we met, that we met at the subway. And moreover, I can reasonably expect that everybody else will remember that too. So maybe we didn't actually explicitly agree on where we're going to meet up this time, but all of us decide individually to go to the subway, because we all think, well, that's where we met last time, I remember that, and I can also see that everybody else is going to remember that as well, and probably we're all going to do the same thing. We're probably all independently going to decide to go to the subway. So we might decide to, on the second occasion, to meet at the subway for that reason. Basically just because we did that last time, and we know that everybody remembers that we did that last time. And of course, if that's what you do the second time, that's going to sort of reinforce things going forward. The third time we go to the movie theater, even if we don't explicitly agree about where to meet, we'll probably just automatically meet at the subway. And you can easily see how something becomes a convention from there. So what's going on here, basically, is that precedence is a highly effective way for something to become a convention. If that's what we did the last time when we faced this situation, there's pretty good reason for everybody to expect that everybody will behave as if they agree to do that on this occasion as well. You can imagine that with a camping case as well. Like suppose we all went camping together, this is our second occasion, we remember exactly which directions we all went in last time. We're probably all going to go in the same directions this time because we're both going to remember what we did, and we're also going to think, well, everybody else is going to come to the same conclusion as me, namely to do what we did last time. And then the next time you go camping, you'll probably go through the same reasoning again, and it's kind of, again, easy to see how it becomes a convention from there. So in both of these cases, there's no decision to make something a convention. Maybe the first time you decide on that occasion to do something a certain way, but you're not like making a rule for all occasions. But the mere fact that you did that on a previous time is going to inevitably give everyone a really strong reason to keep behaving in that way, unless like something comes up. And that's exactly a way for a convention to arise. Precedence is really, really salient, it really, really sticks out, and so the fact that we all did something in the past can turn into a regularity that's a convention really easily. And as we can see, in those cases, there's no verbal agreement to make it a convention. Maybe there's a verbal agreement at the beginning that you do something, but there's no verbal agreement that something become a convention. So we can sort of see in Lewis's analysis why conventions can arise without language, why you don't need to necessarily decide on something through language for it to be a convention. So that's what a convention is. We've seen a bunch of different examples, we drew out some features that they all seem to have, and we saw that those features are basically what Lewis's account of a convention is. In the next video, we're going to now see how we actually apply the account of convention to get an understanding of a conventional account of meaning.